Today we're going to be talking about the 2026 midterm monetary policy. Let's talk about something that's been on everyone's mind right now. What's actually happening with our money? If you've been in Harare this past week, you've heard the same question. And this question is everywhere. Is the ZEC actually holding up, or are we being set up for another shock? On Thursday, Reserve Bank Governor Dr. John Mushayavanu released the 2026 midterm monetary policy statement. And here's the headline they're pushing. The Reserve Bank has hit all its targets under the IMF Staff Monitored Program. They've cut the bank policy rate from 35% down to 30%, pointing to structural single-digit inflation that's held steady since early 2026. They also claim foreign exchange inflows jumped significantly during the first half of the year. What the bank says versus what street reality actually says. Let's actually break this down on what the numbers actually say. The first quarter reserve money closed at 5.73 billion ZEC, and that's below the IMF target ceiling of 5.95 billion ZEC. Second quarter reserve money stood at 6.60 billion ZEC, again below the 7.33 billion ceiling. Here's the striking part. Year-on-year reserve money growth slowed sharply from 243.9% in June 2025 down to just 39.3% in June 2026. That's a dramatic slowdown. Bankers put it well when they said the key isn't simply that reserve money is increasing, but that its growth is being kept within clearly defined program targets. That gives the market greater confidence that liquidity creation is being managed in a disciplined manner. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Broad money supply, that's M3 for those who follow the jargon, expanded by 31.4% to reach the 142 billion ZEC by mid-year. The RBZ says recent price stability in local retail markets comes from tighter liquidity controls. But let's be real. If you sit down with a business owner in downtown Harare or any importer bringing goods from South Africa, the gap between the official rate and the parallel market hasn't magically disappeared. People are still hedging in US dollars because history has taught us to be cautious. The monocurrency roadmap, now that the governor has made something crystal clear. Switching to the ZEC as the exclusive legal currency isn't happening on a rigid calendar deadline. It's condition-based and market-driven. Here's the actual progress. Zimbabwe has recorded a 50.1% weighted progress score on the macroeconomic conditions required to transition to a sole local currency. But the central bank is stressing that this shouldn't be interpreted as an imminent switch. Deputy Governor Dr. Innocent Mache said this transition is going to be market-driven and it is not something that we expect to happen overnight. Annual ZEC inflation has averaged 4.2% during the first 7 months of 2026. That's significant progress on the stability front. The country remains below the targeted foreign currency reserve threshold required for transition, though reserves stood at 1.7 billion United States dollars at the end of July, equivalent to 1.7 months of import cover. The target is between 3 and 6 months. Direct impacts on citizens is something we need to look at. Here's the bottom line for you. If you're earning in local currency, the slowdown in inflation gives a bit of breathing room, but bank charges and transactional costs are still eating into daily budgets. The central bank is trying to prove to the IMF that it has stopped printing money recklessly, and whether they stick to that promise dictates what your salary is worth next month. Dr. Mache made an important point. No one and nobody will be forced to exchange their foreign currency into the domestic currency. What will happen is that domestic transactions will not be possible in foreign currency. That's the eventual goal. But we're not there yet. And for now, the US dollars aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Fuel, rent, and major services will keep trading in greenbacks for the foreseeable future. We'll hear more from our experts as we cross over to them.
The latest monetary policy statement gives a surprisingly different picture from Zimbabwe's past currency crises, or shall I say, plural for emphasis, because that's how many we have had. For the first 7 months of 2026, the ZEC has remained relatively stable, trading at around 25 to 27 ZEC to the US dollar, while the parallel market premium has narrowed to about 15%. So based on the numbers in the statement, there's no immediate sign of another currency crash yet. But here is where things get interesting. What is happening with the money itself? The Reserve Bank has been very deliberate about controlling the amount of local currency liquidity in the system. Reserve money stood at 34.69 billion in June, but only about 20% of that was local currency. More importantly, growth in the ZEC component of reserve money slowed dramatically, from almost 280% a year earlier to about 42%. That's a major difference. At the same time, broader money supply is increasing, rising about 31.4% between December and 2025 and June this year, reaching about 142 billion ZEC. But the Reserve Bank says this increase has not translated into another inflation explosion. Why? Because much of the growth is coming from foreign currency deposits, while exchange rate stability, fiscal restraint, and stronger market confidence are helping to keep inflation under control. And there's another important number. Zimbabwe now has about 1.7 billion US dollars in foreign currency reserves. The Reserve Bank says those reserves cover the entire ZEC deposit base by almost 1.5 times, and the reserve money by about 6 times. That is the strongest argument in the statement that ZEC is currently backed by a much stronger position than during previous currency crises. But there is still vulnerability. At 1.7 billion US dollars, that represents only 1.7 months of import cover. And the Reserve Bank itself says it wants to reach about 1.8 to 2 months by the end of by the end of the year, while the longer term target is 3 to 6 months. So ZEC is not showing signs of an imminent crash, but neither is the currency completely out of danger. Right now. For now, the story is one of managed stability, with the Reserve Bank trying to make sure that money grows fast enough to support the economy, but not so fast that it once again destroys confidence in the currency. And that is the real test for ZEC, because at the end of the day, if you're doing that, that means you're deliberately lowering the liquidity amount, deliberately lowering the demand for liquidity. So you have a situation where liquidity is so much, yet the demand, when liquidity demand is so much, yet you're only supplying at least a tenth or a quarter of the amount, just to give you a rough idea. So the question then becomes, what happens to the exchange rate when you then supply the market with its full amount of liquidity? That's the test of the ZEC. If the ZEC does not move and generally stays between that 25 to 27 ZEC to the US dollar, great. Well done. We have done it. But if it does move, then we know everything the Reserve Bank doing is artificial. And I believe we're still in that artificial territory. The true test is paying the government suppliers, who are now owed several billion, dollars, pushing the amount of liquidity into the market to allow it to function without changing the exchange rate. That is the test. But for now, what the Reserve Bank has done is stabilize the exchange rate. But in a market where the economy is growing, which means that liquidity demand must grow as well, we ask ourselves, how long can this succeed without the bubble bursting?
Now let's look at cross-border infrastructure and the fourth South Africa-Zimbabwe Binational Commission. If you've ever stood in line at Beitbridge or run a cross-border logistics hustle, this update is massive for you. President Emmerson Mnangagwa was down in Pretoria on Friday meeting President Cyril Ramaphosa for the fourth session of the South Africa-Zimbabwe Binational Commission. This is the highest level platform for advancing bilateral relations. And this session was about converting shared history and economic interests into concrete development initiatives. Let's look at what they agreed on. Now, let me give you the lowdown on what actually affects daily life across the region. First, the Limpopo Bridge project. Both governments formally identified this as a primary cross-border priority. Right now, commercial trucks still burn hours, sometimes days, waiting on paperwork and narrow bridge lanes. They also looked at the one-stop border post framework. They're officially pushing to make this fully operational at Beitbridge. A real one-stop setup means clearing customs once instead of twice, which cuts the cost of importing everything from groceries to heavy machinery. They also looked at development financing. The development banks of Southern Africa and the Industrial Development Corporation were directed to anchor joint funding mechanisms for regional power transmission, water transport, and trade logistics corridor infrastructure. Minister Ronald Lamola set the tone at the ministerial segment on Thursday, saying that their political relationship is strong and the historical bonds between South Africa and Zimbabwe are deep, and their geographical proximity creates enormous opportunities. What is required now is to convert these advantages into concrete programs and projects that improve the lives of the Zimbabwean and South African people. So let's look at the trade imbalance tensions. President Ramaphosa brought up the structural trade imbalance. South Africa exports way more to us as Zimbabweans than we send to them. Figures from Zimtrade show Zimbabwe exported goods worth about $2.2 United States billion to South Africa last year, while imports were estimated to be approximately 3.8 billion United States dollars. That's a significant gap. Lamola also highlighted migration, noting that Zimbabwe accounts for 48% of migrants in South Africa. He emphasized the need for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and unequivocally rejected xenophobia and violence directed at foreign nationals. The agreements signed several agreements and memoranda of understanding were signed covering agriculture, gender equality, correctional services, diplomacy, and arts and culture. High-impact projects identified include the third Limpopo Bridge, operationalization of a Beitbridge one-stop border post, fertilizer manufacturing, automotive component production, and platinum group metals beneficiation. President Ramaphosa said inclusive economic growth will give both countries the means to widen access to food, shelter, health, education, water, and sanitation. And of course, it will give both countries the means to create employment and economic opportunities, especially for women and for the young. The bottom line for trade and transport for everyday Zimbabweans. It means that easier trade means a better stock on local shelves. But for local manufacturers, it means competing against cheaper South African goods. If these infrastructure promises actually turn into tarmac and concrete cross-border traders, and families are going to see faster transit times and lower freight markups. President Mnangagwa summed it up well. He says when South Africa thrives, Zimbabwe also thrives, and vice versa. The challenge now is making sure these commitments don't just stay on paper. Now let's look at electoral reforms and transition of the voter registration to Home Affairs. This next issue is a huge political and administrative shift that a lot of people missed whilst focusing possibly on the economy. The government is moving ahead with operationalizing Constitutional Amendment number 3, shifting voter registration duties away from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and handing them over to the Civil Registry Department under the Ministry of Home Affairs, Justice, Legal, and Parliamentary Affairs. Minister Ziyambi confirmed in Parliament that the constitutional changes took effect after President Mnangagwa signed the bill into law. The law is now in force and working. Let's look at how it used to work versus now. So previously, ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, ran its own voter registration drives, built its own roll, and issued voter slips. Under the new framework, when you go to get your national ID at the Registrar-General's office, you're essentially captured for the voter's roll at the same time. Deputy Chief Secretary Zine Chimwe Churu, represented at a Bulawayo workshop, explained this is not merely an administrative exercise, but rather a constitutional and institutional milestone that speaks to our nation's collective resolve to strengthen our democratic processes in line with the supreme law of the land. The Registrar-General is the custodian of the Civil Registry, the National Population Register, which records births, deaths, marriages, and the identity of every citizen. Say that it is best placed to ensure that the voter's roll is a seamless and accurate reflection of our citizenry. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission Chief Elections Officer Simbarashe Tongai confirmed that 93 experienced ZEC voter registration officers across 68 electoral districts will be directly integrated into the Civil Registry Department to preserve institutional memory and prevent system breakdown during migration. Tongai was quite emphatic on what he wanted to assure the nation, and he said at policy level, there is no one who is going to be affected in terms of retrenchment, and everyone is going to be accommodated. What do you need to know as citizens? The Civil Registry Department has historically struggled with long queues, power cuts, and system downtimes just issuing basic IDs. Handing them the master voter database raises major questions about data privacy, voters' roll transparency, and political neutrality. The integration of the two systems is expected to eliminate duplication and improve the accuracy of voter information. But officials also called for an efficient handover that safeguards the integrity and security of voter registration data. If you're turning 18 or trying to update your voting address, keep your documentation safe because the migration process is where records usually get misplaced. The government is amending the Electoral Act and the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission Act to bring them in line with the revised constitution.
I want to reiterate that the success of the handover takeover, it hinges on cooperation, teamwork, and inclusive planning. A central principle guiding these engagements is the government's emphasis on a whole government approach, which calls for government institutions to work in a coordinated manner towards common national objectives. And for this reason, we have invited other MDAs to be part and parcel of this meeting so that they will assist us in the process. We have Public Service Commission, Ministry of Information, our Parent Ministry, Justice.
We'll hear more from our experts as we cross over to them.
It is a great shame and a stain on our constitutional democracy that the functions of ZEC are already being transferred to the Registrar-General's office, when there are court cases pending before the Constitutional Court as we speak, challenging Constitutional Amendment number 3, and in particular challenging the issue of our elections no longer being conducted by an independent commission, but by an arm of the executive. I have been advised that staff members from the Registrar-General's office said during the transfer process that they do not have capacity to actually handle all of these sensitive files at the Registrar-General's office, and that those who spoke up were threatened with being dismissed. I think it just goes to show that this has got absolutely nothing to do with capacity or efficiency, but it has everything to do with control, with ensuring that the president and the president's party have absolute control over the elections and that nothing is left to chance. No independence should be left in the electoral process. It should all be under the thumb of the executive, and that is a great shame. It's truly shocking that all of these things are being implemented while the Concord cases are pending. It just demonstrates that the talk of being constitutionalists is all talk, and that there's no real interest in allowing the process to follow its due course. The question has to be asked: what happens if the Constitutional Court declares that Constitutional Amendment number 3 was unconstitutional, and that it ought to have gone to a referendum, which the court has the power to do? What then happens? Will all of those files that have already been transferred to the Registrar-General's office now need to be transferred back? What of the senators that have already been appointed to the Senate? What happens if laws are passed and senators who are later found to have been unlawfully appointed have voted in favor of legislation which is passed? It just creates a constitutional mess which is designed to put pressure on the judiciary not to undo the unlawfulness of Constitutional Amendment number 3, notwithstanding the fact that it is brazenly unlawful and unconstitutional.
Now let's look at professional standards versus legislative competence. We want to look at a debate taking place across Zimbabwe right now, an issue that touches on governance, fairness, and leadership standards. A petition submitted to Zimbabwe's parliament is calling for the driving profession to be formalized, including the introduction of minimum educational qualifications for drivers. The government is moving forward with strict minimum educational and certification standards for professional drivers, public transport operators, and heavy vehicle drivers. The goal is straightforward: protect public safety, enforce competence, and hold drivers accountable on our roads. Now let's look at the public contradiction. Think about this. If you want to drive a public bus carrying 60 passengers or steer a heavy haulage truck carrying fuel down the highway, the state requires proof of competence, medical checks, verified qualifications, and ongoing testing. But to become a member of parliament, where you write, vote on, and implement the laws that govern 16 million people, the baseline requirement in many jurisdictions is simply being a registered voter of a certain age, often with no minimum educational thresholds required. The central question is uncomfortable but necessary. Why should a public omnibus driver need certified competence to handle a steering wheel, whilst the lawmakers steering the nation's entire legal and economic system are exempt from similar qualifications or performance metrics? There are two sides to this debate, and both deserve a hearing. The case of competence and meritocracy. Proponents argue that modern governance is highly technical. Understanding fiscal policies, trade treaties, and complex legal statutes requires analytical rigor, basically literacy and policy expertise. Without standards, Parliament risks rubber stamping bills it does not fully comprehend. If we're serious about development, we need serious people making serious decisions, right? Now let's look at the constitutional and democratic counter-argument. Constitutional scholars and civil rights advocates caution against rigid academic qualifications for public office. Historical discrimination, unequal access to higher education, and rural disadvantage mean that imposing strict degree requirements could disenfranchise millions of grassroots leaders, community elders, and working class citizens from participating in their own democracy. Think about it. Some of the most effective community leaders have never set foot in a university lecture hall. Does that make them less capable of representing their communities? The democratic ideal is that the people choose who represents them, not that a piece of paper determines who's eligible. Now, if we look at the demand for performance and accountability, the consensus growing among citizens isn't necessarily about requiring university degrees. It's about demanding systemic accountability, transparent public performance reviews, and rigorous civic training for anyone entrusted with making national laws. Can we demand that MPs demonstrate basic literacy in the subjects that they legislate on? Can we require ongoing professional development for lawmakers? Can we hold them accountable for poor performance in the same way we would hold our bus drivers accountable for unsafe driving? The debate isn't going away, and honestly, it shouldn't. Because at its heart, this is about what kind of leadership we deserve and what standards we should expect from those who govern us. We'll hear more from our experts as we cross over to them.
The truth of the matter is, of course, education is important. And I think one of the big discussions at the moment is, the way that the parliament is now adopting education as a source of how intelligent a person is. Definitely, some of the most competent people and the most successful people in businesses were not even well educated. History will tell you. In fact, if you look at those who have got mental challenges, physical challenges, or some who were not considered to be clever in the education environment, ended up doing so well. In history, there is a whole lot of them who are said to have had to be dyslexic, to be incompetent and all that, and they did very well. So education cannot be a measure of how competent a person is. That's one of the things that I'll say. And then we go to the next level where we talk about legislation, where they are now saying, oh, I don't believe what they say about 5 levels, a person cannot do this, or 5 levels, a person can do this. And that should be taken away. And anybody who is capable should be able to go into certain positions. But when you look at what is happening in Zim now, is they're looking at education. Yet, I can tell you confidently, we have discovered that a lot of people in Zimbabwe have got fake qualifications. Look at almost everybody in cabinet is now a doctor. But some have been exposed to have had qualifications that are fake. And sadly, with those kind of things that have been raised by a lot of people out there, nobody has gone out to prove, whatever you have said about me, this is my piece of paper. This is what I did. This is where I went to school, and this is what we did. So we've got legislators who are obviously have got something to hide, and they hide by having fake qualifications. Then we go to the next stage where we talk about professional competence. Professional competence, those are the people who have been tried and tested. I mean, if you look at, for example, chartered accountants or management training programs that have been running probably for the last 100 years for the most competent organizations. A person comes in, no matter who you are, you clean the floor, you clean the windows, you go onto the front desk, you do the selling, until after about 6 months, or some take 6 months and some take a year, in order for you to cover each and every sector and competence level for that particular organization. And they're supposed to pass certain levels of capabilities. So when you look at the two, there's a difference between competence standards and legislation competence, because legislation competence, if you look at the parliaments of Africa, they have failed, and they've failed dismally, because people that go into that parliament are selected by friends and relatives. And they claim some of them are voted, but we know what happens in Africa. Some of them are not even voted. There is a lot of corruption process that takes place for one to be in parliament. So we've got those challenges, and I hope this answers the question that you're asking. Do we have competent parliamentarians? No, we don't. I don't think so. Because even if you ask them, we have designed a system for qualification verification that has not been adopted. It's there and it's ready for anybody who is ready to use it. Then we go on to professional conduct. Professional competence professional standards is the process that people go through in order for them to say, this guy is capable, or this lady is capable. And that doesn't happen to parliamentarians. So we hope that answers your questions, and take away this thing of qualifications. Qualifications are no longer important worldwide. Now that we've got artificial intelligence coming in, we've got a totally different environment altogether. It's going to take away a lot of what we consider intelligent people, because it has occupied that gap for intelligence. I hope that answers your respective question. Thank you.
Now, let's look at the massive update dominating national conversations right now. The growing alarm over a potential super El Nino threatening the upcoming 2026-27 rainy season. Fresh alerts from international forecasting centres, including warnings highlighted by the UK Met Office and our own Meteorological Services Department, indicate that the incoming El Nino phase could be one of the strongest on record since 1950. On Friday, the UK's Met Office said the incoming El Nino could be an unprecedented event. The scale of economic risk is not just looking at weather. This is just also about survival. Historical data shows that in years hit hard by El Nino, local maize production can drop by more than half, costing the economy upwards of 300 million United States dollars. With over 80% of Zimbabwean agriculture depending on seasonal rainfall, a dry season directly ripples into food inflation, urban purchasing power, and industrial raw material shortages. Livestock is another major concern. More than 1 million cattle reportedly died during the 91-1992 El Nino, while 44,766 deaths were recorded during the 2023-2024 drought. Water security is also critical. More than 12,000 boreholes dried up during the 2015-2016 El Nino, while 6,028 rural boreholes were dysfunctional during the 2023-2024 drought. The government's 6-point mitigation strategy has been activated, and they're looking at their preparedness plan. Now let's look at some of these points. There's been the Fumvunza in Twasa expansion targeting 1 million households to practice conservation agriculture, emphasizing 3 plots per homestead. Agriculture Permanent Secretary Professor Beitbridge said irrigation infrastructure and fertilizers are useless if the seed placed in the soil cannot withstand thermal stress, optimize water use efficiency, or resist emerging pathogens. The second point is around drought-resistant seeds, fast-tracking climate-smart crop varieties that withstand thermal stress and low rainfall. Modern breeding technologies could reduce the time required to develop new varieties from 10 to 12 years to 4 to 6 years. Let's also look at strategic grain reserves. Building up reserves towards a 450,000-ton target backed by modern AI-powered grain silos. We also are looking at livestock protection. To prevent the loss of tens of thousands of cattle seen in past droughts, the state is pushing a target of 7 million hay bales and promoting resilient local breeds like Mashona and Boran. The 5th point was water security and boreholes, repairing and protecting rural water points before subterranean tables drop. And the 6th point was contingency frameworks, aligning with international bodies like the World Food Programme and utilizing early warning networks under the Early Warnings for All initiative launched in Mutare on Thursday by the Meteorological Services Department. Zimbabwe has positioned itself ahead of the anticipated 2026-27 El Nino season. The African Union has urged member states to strengthen climate resilience against the looming weather threats. And Zimbabwe has already moved from reactive drought relief to proactive climate resilience. Professor Jiri said the strategy was designed to safeguard agricultural production, protect livelihoods, and sustain national food security despite possible adverse weather conditions. The entire agricultural and financial sector is shifting into an anticipatory disaster management mode. Instead of scrambling after a drought hits, the country is working to drought-proof operations before a single seed goes into the ground. The focus now is on acting before the shock arrives, preparing fields, securing water and livestock feed, strengthening grain reserves, and ensuring warnings reach communities early enough for farmers to act. Thank you so much for joining us on The Fate of the Nation. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and we'll see you next time.